They called it the silence before the storm, but that silence had a name: deterrence. For decades, it held together a dangerous, simmering status quo in the Middle East, a chessboard of proxies, black ops, sabotage, and carefully calibrated strikes. Then, in the space of 12 days, that fragile architecture cracked. Airfields, underground bunkers, commanders, research sites, struck, retaliated against, and struck again. The world watched as two adversaries turned decades of shadow warfare into a short, violent blaze that rewired regional politics. This is the story of those 12 days, how it started, what happened inside those hours, who stood behind each move, and why the consequences will be felt for years to come. To understand 12 days of open fire, we have to go back through 60 years of mistrust. Israel and Iran never fought a full conventional war, but they have been locked in a prolonged asymmetric contest. Iran built influence through proxies: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and armed groups in Gaza and Yemen. Israel answered with targeted airstrikes, sabotage of nuclear and weapons programs, and covert operations against commanders and scientists. After the October 7th Hamas attack and the long Gaza war that followed, the region's tensions soared. Tehran openly cheered and financed its proxies, and Israel sought to deny Iran the means to sustain a wider front. This background is where the tinder for the fire accumulated. In the months leading up to June 2025, the escalations were smaller but telling. There were reported Israeli strikes on Iranian positions in Syria and Iraq, and Iranian missile and drone strikes aimed at Israeli forces across the region. Alarming intelligence assessments suggested Tehran's nuclear program was advancing. Israeli leaders repeatedly warned they would not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon and signaled their willingness to use force preemptively. In turn, Iranian leaders vowed that any Israeli attack would be treated as a declaration of war. The tension had become almost mechanical. One side's red line triggered the others. On the morning of June 13, 2025, Israeli forces launched a large coordinated strike inside Iran. Officials later described it as an operation targeting nuclear and military infrastructure and even specific scientific personnel. According to multiple reports, the strike was extensive, involving airstrikes and long-range assets directed at facilities Israel said posed an existential threat. Iranian officials immediately called it a declaration of war. Within hours, Iran launched hundreds of drones and missiles toward Israel in retaliation. Relying on its advanced air defenses, Israel intercepted many of them. The exchange had moved from the shadows into daylight. What made this operation different was threefold. First, the scale. Reports indicated dozens, if not hundreds, of highly coordinated sorties and long-range strike packages. The targets weren't just isolated military depots, but sensitive nuclear-adjacent facilities. Second, the precision and intelligence. Israeli sources claimed the strikes eliminated senior commanders and scientists, a blow intended to degrade Iran's capability for years to come. Third, the diplomatic choreography. Accounts conflicted on whether allies were warned in advance, what the United States' role was, and whether any back channels for de-escalation were open. These three elements pushed the clash into a new category, not a skirmish, but an overt high-stakes confrontation. The first 48 to 72 hours were a blur of air raid sirens, intercepted missiles, and political statements. Iran launched waves of drones and ballistic missiles toward Israel. Israeli defenses, Iron Dome, David's Sling, and fighter patrols absorbed the brunt of the attack, while counterstrikes were executed across the region. At the same time, proxy actors like Hezbollah and Hamas watched closely, but largely held back, delivering only limited responses. Analysts later pointed to a mix of Iran's own calculations, its partners' exhaustion after years of fighting, and intense international pressure as reasons they didn't open a full second front. This was not only a campaign against infrastructure. Civilians were killed and displaced. Neighborhoods near targeted sites in Iranian cities were hit. The deaths of named military officials and a handful of scientists became headline news, symbolizing a new level of targeting. Not just facilities, but the people whose knowledge could recreate them. On the Israeli side, Air raid shelters opened across the country, and the government constantly spoke of an existential threat, language that ratchets public sentiment toward total war. Even when the air defenses worked, the psychological toll was enormous. Global reaction was immediate and fractured. Israel leaned on diplomatic backing from its closest partners, framing the attack as necessary to prevent a nuclear threat. Washington's response, limited publicly but decisive behind the scenes, was watched closely. Whether the U.S. warned, supported, or sought to limit the strike shaped both the operation and the crisis management that followed. Other world powers called for restraint, while regional governments condemned the violence, fearing what might come next. The United Nations warned of regional spillover and a humanitarian catastrophe. After the initial shock, the conflict settled into a grim rhythm. Israel struck further targets it said were linked to missile production, radar, and command nodes. Iran continued its barrages, experimenting with swarm tactics and standoff launches. Cyber attacks and information warfare accompanied the physical strikes. Television feeds, official statements, and social media became weapons to sustain morale and narrate success. Observers noted that despite the ferocity, both sides showed a key restraint. A full conventional invasion was avoided. This suggested that even in a direct confrontation, red lines, and the fear of catastrophic escalation, remained. Intelligence played a central role. Years of covert activity, sabotage of centrifuges, assassinations, and cyber intrusions had already degraded Iran's programs and provided focused targets for the strikes. Each side also leveraged leaks to shape the narrative. Israel released selected claims about the nature of its targets, while Iran released footage of the damage and lists of the dead. In the fog of war, independent verification was difficult, a fact both militaries exploited. This is modern warfare. The battlefield is as much about what you can convince the world you did as what you actually destroyed. By the second week, several pressures converged to push toward a pause. Diplomatic channels intensified as regional and global powers pressed both sides to avoid an open-ended war. The visible cost, in lives, infrastructure, and risk to the global economy, made continued bombardment increasingly dangerous. Iran signaled it had made its point, while Israel declared that its key objectives had been met. The politics at home also mattered. Leaders in both Jerusalem and Tehran had to weigh public demand for revenge against the practical limits of total war. The endgame wasn't a battlefield knockout, but a pause that allowed both governments to claim a victory. On the 12th day, official statements framed the end of hostilities differently. Israel's leadership hailed a historic victory, claiming its strikes had rolled back an existential threat and degraded Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. Iran framed its retaliation as forceful enough to deter any future aggression. Outside analysts saw a more complicated truth. Both sides had taken losses, both had inflicted them, and both had preserved the option of future confrontation. The narrative victory was as important as the military one. So, what changed after those 12 days? First, military doctrine. Israel showcased its long-range strike options and a new willingness to attack inside Iran. Tehran, meanwhile, learned the limits of its proxy network and the high cost of a direct exchange. Second, proxy politics. The reluctance of some Iran-backed groups to join a wider war exposed cracks in Tehran as axis of resistance. And finally, diplomacy and deterrence. The episode reset the calculations for every major power, revealing who could be relied upon and how quickly a crisis could spiral. It's crucial to grasp why both sides stopped short of unlimited war. A full-scale conflict risked a broader regional conflagration involving global powers, critical shipping lanes, and the world's energy supply. Both states also faced domestic constraints and the risk of international isolation. Where the conflict did change things was in perception. The bar for direct military action was lowered. That paradox, where a short war normalizes new types of strikes, but also hardens deterrent postures, is the conflict's enduring lesson. Future observers will now watch three things closely: whether Iran rebuilds its sensitive programs in more secure locations, whether Israel institutionalizes the aggressive operational strategies it just deployed, and whether regional proxies return to active engagement or remain cautious. The 12 days changed the military balance in some ways, but more importantly, it changed the story each side tells itself, and those stories drive policy more than we often admit. 12 days of explosions and televised grief were a reminder that modern wars don't always announce themselves with full mobilizations. Sometimes they are quick, sharp, and transformative, leaving behind a new map of power and fear. The question the world must now wrestle with is simple and terrible. How do we deter nuclear ambitions without making permanent war the new normal? If history teaches us anything, it's that the silence between strikes must be filled with diplomacy, not just strategy. If this video gave you clarity on a complex moment, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below with what you'd like us to investigate next. Thanks for watching.